All right, today we're going to talk about proportions. I actually think proportions are one of the easier topics if you just connect it to equations. Don't think of proportions as this totally different thing. It really is the same thing as just balancing. Okay? So the way we solve proportions, a proportion, just so you know, it's a fraction equals a fraction. So it's some sort of a fraction with an equal sign in the middle and another fraction. Always make sure that you put an equal sign in the middle whenever you're setting up a proportion. All right, now here is the only time you ever use that phrase, cross multiplication. All right, we don't use that for adding fractions, we don't use that for multiplying fractions, we don't use that for dividing fractions. We only use this phrase with proportions. All right, so don't try to do this any other time. Okay, it's only done with proportions. All right, so in this case, again, in the process, so carrying on through the rest, after you cross multiply, if you ever see add or subtract, you put parentheses, you can cross multiply, distribute, and then it's just balancing. And you'll see how connected this is to balancing equations. All right, so here's a problem. This is what I would consider it would be a hard problem if they didn't give you this information. So I'm going to show you how they wrote this equation so that in the future, if you're only given a picture, you know how to set up your proportion. So when you're setting up a proportion, the first thing you want to do is compare two pieces. All right, so in this case, we're comparing the height of triangles to the base of triangles. So the heights would be these numbers. The bases would be this big triangle base and this little triangle base. All right, so when we look at the big triangle had a height of 15 and a base of this whole length, which was x plus 8. So that was the base of this triangle, the big triangle. The little triangle had a height of 10, but a base of only x. All right, so again, this is a proportion because we have a fraction equals a fraction with, again, an equal sign in the middle. So the next thing you want to do is if you ever have a fraction with adding or subtracting inside of it, like right here, do you see how we have 8 plus x? One of the things that I highly recommend doing, you don't need to, but I highly recommend it, reduces error significantly. The second you see that, put parentheses. And the reason we do that is this tells us that before we're allowed to divide, we're really supposed to add these numbers together. So you always put those in parentheses. All right. So once you have them in parentheses, now we move on to cross multiplication. Now cross multiplication isn't anything, again, it's just the same thing as balancing. How do you remove fractions in an equation? By multiplying by the common denominator. So in this case, what we're basically doing is we're saying, okay, what's the opposite of divide by x? Times x. So I circle these two and I say, this is going to be multiplied by x. So that'll cancel out and you're left with 15 times x. Then you put an equal sign, equals, well, what's the opposite of dividing by 8 plus x? Well, the opposite of division is multiplying. So you multiply by 8 plus x. So then this side, you cross multiply, and you say 10 times, again, don't forget your parentheses, which we added, 10 times 8 plus x. All right, so again, when you cross multiply, very important. It's not anything different. It's just the opposite of division is multiplication. So that's what we're actually doing in this problem. All right, so the next thing you do is, if you ever see parentheses, you want to distribute. So the reason why we added those parentheses was so that we wouldn't mess up at this step. So here I see parentheses, so I'm going to multiply 10 to both of those terms. So this gives us 15 times x, which is 15x, equals 10 times 8 is 80, plus 10 times x, which is 10x. All right, so we have now distributed. So now we've got to move our terms. So our next step is obviously, here's our thing, we're going to move the terms to the correct side. So here I got 15x, 80, 10x. The x's need to be together. So I've got to move this to the opposite side. When you move it, you do the inverse operations. The opposite of plus 10x is obviously negative 10x. Those cancel out. You get 5x equals 80. All right, now we can finally solve. The opposite of times 5 is divide by 5. All right. Oh, I think that's on the next slide. Let me double check. The last step, solve for the variable. So again, the opposite of times 5 is divide by 5. So that gives us x is equal to 16. All right, that means that this length right here is going to be 16. All right? And that's how you do a proportion. It is the same thing as equations. Just remember, when you have those parentheses, or when you have the adding, you've got to put those parentheses. Or if it was subtraction, put those parentheses. That way you remember to distribute.